East Texans gathered for an event that aimed to bring awareness to the visually impaired and their walking aid, the white cane.
KLTV7's Alex Weister spoke with the group who started it and the people they've helped along the way.
The White Cane Day celebration took place at Bergfeld Park to celebrate the achievements of those who are blind or visually impaired. The name of the event and National Day, which takes place October 15th, highlights the symbol of blindness and how it is being used by those who are visually impaired.
Our job, I feel like, as far as in the sighted community, is to educate the sighted world about the possibilities. They're not aware of the technology, they're not aware of the software, the things that help people with visual impairments do the same thing anyone else does.
For many years, the event took place in a smaller capacity at East Texas Lighthouse for the Blind's location in Tyler. As time went on, they have expanded. The group saw they could bring even more awareness to the cause and help more people.
A lot of people don't know what to do about blindness, so they don't do anything at all. They just ignore the person. Blind people want to have friends and want to engage and talk to people just like anyone else. And so I just want to get to a point where the sighted world is more comfortable with blindness.
Cody Woodruff says losing his sight after having it for many years was difficult. Now, having gotten help and adjusting, he hopes events such as White Cane Day will help show what people who are visually impaired are capable of and kick some of the stigmas surrounding them.
Just talk to them. Most people that are visually impaired and blind don't have no problem with talking about how they live their lives or what they might be able to do to help people understand what it's like to go through this.
Alex Weister, KLTV7 News.
The East Texas Lighthouse for the Blind works to incorporate more inclusive events throughout the year. One of their staple events is Camp Lighthouse. That's a 5-day camp for blind and visually impaired high school students.